Well, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
What if Canada is currently facing the most critical decision in the last 30 years? A decision that could permanently alter its position in the global economy. On one hand, there is pressure from Washington, the threat of trade sanctions, and loud statements that American industry must come first. On the other, there is an unexpected offer from Beijing so generous that Ottawa calls it a golden trap. Behind the scenes of negotiations that are not covered by television channels or newspapers, the fate of all North American trade is being decided. And if until recently Canada was considered the most reliable ally of the US, now even within the government they are asking themselves, is it an ally or just a tool in someone else's game?
They don't allow our banks. Did you know that? Canada does not allow banks to go in.
After the US Secretary of Commerce's loud statement that cars should be assembled in America, and only in America, economic ties that had been built up over decades began to crumble. According to industry sources, the three largest car manufacturers are already preparing plans to transfer part of their production from Ontario to Michigan and Texas. Canadian unions are talking about tens of thousands of jobs that could disappear by the end of the year. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The real threat lies deeper in the very logic of trade, where Canada is increasingly finding itself not as a partner, but as a bargaining chip between two superpowers.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
While Washington dictates the terms, Beijing is taking a different approach. The Chinese government has unexpectedly offered Canada a deal: lift tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for the immediate removal of restrictions on exports of canola, wheat, and peas. Analysts estimate that this could bring up to $6 billion a year back into the Canadian economy. But behind this generosity lies more than just economics. It is a test of independence. Will Canada be able to make a decision for the first time in decades without looking back at the White House? Unofficial reports leaked to the press claim that there is a real struggle going on within the Canadian government. Some officials are demanding that the country maintain its course toward Washington, even if it leads to new losses. Others insist that the country should act in its own interests, rather than under the dictates of its allies. And while mutual accusations fly in the corridors of power, China is playing its hand, promising investments in green technologies, and even the creation of new production facilities on Canadian soil. But all this could become a tool of influence if Ottawa does not set its own rules of the game.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
Today, more is at stake than just tariffs or car deliveries. It is a question of national sovereignty. Will Canada continue to repeat Washington's decisions, sacrificing its industry for the sake of political loyalty? Or will it take a risk and open the door to a new economic era with new partners, new markets, and a new role in the world? This story is not about money, but about power. It is about how two superpowers, the US and China, are quietly fighting over a country that has stood in their shadow for too long. And perhaps for the first time in many years, Canada is ready to step out of it.
And that we take good note of what they're saying. So it's not as if what the Secretary of Commerce has mentioned.
We compete. There are areas where we compete, and it's in those areas where we have to come to an agreement that works. But there are more areas where we are stronger together, and that's what we're focused on. And we're going to get the right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective, for Canada.
The escalation between Washington and Ottawa began with a single phrase, uttered with cold confidence, and at that moment, it became clear that the old concept of a trade partnership no longer existed. When US Trade Minister Howard Lutnick said that Canada must take its place in the automotive industry and recognize America's priority, a tense silence fell over the room. For Canadian officials, accustomed to political courtesies and diplomatic language, this sounded like a direct threat. Lutnick was not talking about negotiations or compromises, but about submission. His words essentially meant that the White House no longer considered Canada an equal participant in the North American industrial chain. And therein lay the new, dangerous logic of the Trump era: allies only as long as their interests do not conflict with those of the United States. The day after the speech, the headlines in Canadian newspapers were uniformly gloomy. Washington has declared an economic blockade on Ottawa. wrote one newspaper. Another clarified, America rejects the idea of a common market. Behind the scenes of parliamentary committees, it was discussed that Latnik's statement was not just part of negotiating pressure, it actually launched the process of severing trade ties that had developed over decades. Canada and the US had been building automotive integration. Since World War II, engines were assembled in Michigan, bodies in Ontario, and finished cars were sold on both sides of the border. Breaking this system meant destroying thousands of contracts and tens of thousands of jobs. However, behind the diplomatic rhetoric lay another, less obvious threat. According to sources in the Canadian Ministry of Industry, representatives of American car companies had already begun informal consultations in February on moving part of their assembly lines south to Ohio and Texas. Formally, this was under the pretext of logistics costs, but informally it was under pressure from Washington. At that moment, no official dared to publicly confirm this information, but panic reigned within the government. Ottawa calculated that if at least 2 large assembly plants closed in Ontario, the region's economy could lose up to 45,000 jobs. For a province where the automotive sector accounts for almost 20% of GDP, this would mean social disaster.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
The Prime Minister convened an emergency meeting with the Ministers of Trade and Foreign Affairs. According to media reports, the discussion lasted more than 5 hours, and the outcome was disappointing. The US no longer viewed Canada as an economic partner. Ottawa was now perceived as a competitor. Latnik essentially announced the White House's new strategy. Everything that can be produced in America will be produced in America. Canada, meanwhile, would have to settle for the role of a supplier of raw materials and components. The reaction within the country was stormy. Trade unions began to prepare mass protests, threatening to block highways. At factories in Windsor and Oshawa, workers hung posters reading, "We built your cars, now you are destroying our lives." At universities, economists debated whether Canada could survive without the American market. And although some experts assured that nothing catastrophic will happen, most understood that this was only the beginning of the pressure. Meanwhile, the American media presented the situation in a different light. On the evening news, Latnik claimed that Canada was to blame because it had benefited too long from its proximity to the United States. He spoke of unfair trade conditions and insufficient investment on the part of Canada, but behind these accusations lay the main point: Washington intended to regain control over the entire production chain. Sources in the White House later confirmed that this was a long-term strategy, in fact, a revision of the principles of NAFTA.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
In Ottawa, all this was perceived as a frank ultimatum. But just as Canada was trying to grasp the scale of the threat, the situation changed unexpectedly, and not thanks to the US. Almost simultaneously with Latnik's speech in Toronto, a meeting between government representatives and a Chinese delegation took place in Ottawa. The Chinese ambassador conveyed a proposal that immediately caused a sensation. Beijing was ready to lift its tariffs on Canadian canola and other agricultural products if Canada removed its prohibitive 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. It was a diplomatic move made with surgical precision at a time when Canada felt most vulnerable. For Canadian farmers, such a proposal seemed almost like a lifeline. After Ottawa copied US tariffs on Chinese electric cars last year, Beijing responded in kind, hitting agricultural exports. The Canadian prairies, where most canola is grown, lost access to one of the world's largest markets. Farmers' incomes fell by a third, warehouses overflowed, and the government was forced to pay compensation to avoid bankruptcies. Now China was offering to fix everything but on one condition: to abandon unconditional support for the American trade line.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
This proposal divided the country. Heated debates began in Parliament. Some argued that an agreement with China was the way to restore the economy, while others warned that it was a trap. China, they said, gives nothing for free, and any rapprochement would be perceived by Washington as betrayal. But behind the scenes of the political discussions, a pragmatic argument was being made. Canada had been paying the price for other people's decisions for too long. In an interview with a national television channel, a former minister, now an independent analyst, said, "We act like a vassal. We copy American tariffs, even when they hurt us. It's time to think about ourselves." These words instantly spread across social media, and the hashtag Canada for Canada became a trend. People wrote that they were tired of endless dependence, that it was time to stop fearing Washington. Meanwhile, new signals came from Beijing. Chinese officials hinted that lifting tariffs on canola might only be the first step. Investments in the processing industry and joint projects in green technology are possible in the future. This sparked cautious optimism in Canadian business circles. Some electrical component manufacturers even began to consider the idea of setting up joint ventures with Chinese companies, provided that the government did not interfere.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Washington, of course, did not remain indifferent. The day after information about the Chinese proposal leaked to the press, Latnik spoke again, this time in Washington. He said that some allies should remember whose side they are on, adding that any deals that undermine Western trade cohesion will have consequences. The American media interpreted this statement as a warning to Ottawa. The White House essentially made it clear that any attempt to cozy up to Beijing would be seen as an act of insubordination. It was then that Canada was faced with a choice that divided the government and society. On the one hand, there was the familiar dependence on the US, the largest market, guarantor of security, and military partner. On the other hand, there was a real opportunity to save its own economy, regain markets, and show that the country was capable of acting independently. Economic experts estimated that if Chinese tariffs were lifted, Canada could regain up to $6 billion in export revenue in the first year alone. At the same time, the risk of losing American orders for auto parts was estimated at approximately the same amount. All this was happening against a backdrop of growing public pressure. Newspapers wrote that the country is on the cusp of a new era, and talk shows were buzzing with the question, is Canada's independence worth it if it always pays for other people's wars with tariffs and sanctions? In one report, a farmer from Saskatchewan said a simple phrase that became symbolic of the moment. When America sneezes, Canada catches a cold. Maybe it's time to stop standing under its umbrella.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Thus, two events, the ultimatum from Washington and the offer from Beijing, became mirrors in which Canada saw its own position. One reflected a threat, the other a temptation. But both made the country realize that its centuries-old habit of being number two no longer works. A line has now been drawn between loyalty and pragmatism, not just in terms of trade, but in terms of national choice. And for the first time in decades, Ottawa felt that it really did have an alternative, albeit a dangerous one, but its own. Canada's dependence on Washington has long been not just an economic phenomenon, but almost a psychological habit. Decades of cooperation have developed an automatic response. If the US imposes tariffs, Canada does the same. If Washington closes its market to China, Ottawa also slams the door. This reflex of loyalty was justified with phrases about a strategic partnership, but in reality it turned into a trap. When the United States began its protectionist policy under Donald Trump, Canada not only did not resist, but also adopted it as its own. This led to mirror tariffs on Chinese electric cars, a decision that ultimately hit Canada itself, rather than Beijing. At the time, officials explained this as solidarity with an ally, but in reality, it was an attempt to prove loyalty to Washington in exchange for its favor. The irony is that Canada never received any favor.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
After the introduction of American and Canadian tariffs, China responded immediately. Duties on Canadian canola barley, and peas doubled. Millions of tons of crops remained in warehouses in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and domestic market prices collapsed. The government was forced to allocate millions in subsidies to at least partially compensate farmers for their losses. All this was a direct consequence not of Chinese policy, but of American policy, which Canada simply copied. The paradox was that the US, by protecting its market from Chinese electric cars, won its domestic factories received new orders. Canada, deprived of its own production in this segment, lost both consumers and exports. Former NDP leader Tom Mulcair said at the time, "We copy other people's mistakes to appear predictable." This phrase became symbolic of the moment, and a painful admission that Canada has long lacked its own trade strategy. Behind closed doors, officials acknowledged that their policy of dependent following was creating economic holes, but they did not dare to change course. Even when it became clear that mirror tariffs were hurting the domestic market, Ottawa chose not to break ranks with the US, fearing it would irritate Washington. This silent submission turned into a form of economic self-defeat.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
That was when Chinese diplomacy played its hand. There was nothing accidental about Beijing's proposal to lift tariffs on agricultural products in exchange for the abolition of duties on electric vehicles. China understood perfectly well that Canada was on the brink of a trade crisis, dependent on exports and politically tied to the US. This was not a gesture of goodwill, but a carefully calculated maneuver. But oddly enough, it also made sense. For China, opening the Canadian electric car market meant strengthening its position in North America. And for Canada, it was a chance to recoup billions lost due to the decline in agricultural exports.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Heated debates began among experts. Some called China's proposal a Trojan horse, while others called it a rare window of opportunity. Economists calculated that if Canada accepted the deal, it could bring back about $4.5 billion to the market just by restoring canola and barley supplies. In addition, removing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles would give consumers access to cheaper models, which would reduce pressure on the market and accelerate the transition to a green economy. But all this contradicted the American line. Washington continued to take a hard line at this time. Latnick's high-profile statements were followed by unofficial leaks that the White House was considering revising a number of points in the USMCA trade agreement. It was a transparent hint any rapprochement with Beijing would jeopardize Canada's access to the US market. To Ottawa, this sounded like blackmail. Nevertheless, the mood within the government gradually changed. After a series of closed-door meetings with representatives of business and farmers' associations, more and more ministers came to the conclusion that continuing the policy of mirror protectionism would lead the country into recession.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Against this backdrop, an old but pressing problem suddenly came to the fore: Canada's lack of an independent industrial base. While the US can protect its auto industry, Canada does not have the same power. Its industry is closely intertwined with the American one, and every new tariff, every disruption in supply affects the chain on both sides, but especially strongly on the Canadian side. This vulnerability was at the heart of the crisis. The country depended on decisions that were made not in Ottawa, but in Washington. Therefore, China's proposal was perceived not only as an economic solution, but also as a chance to regain the basic right to choose.
Economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
Beijing played on the contrast. While the US threatened sanctions, China spoke of mutual benefit. While Latnick put Canada in second place, Chinese representatives called it an irreplaceable partner. At the diplomatic level, these phrases meant little, but psychologically they had an effect. The Canadian media picked up on the theme, and articles appeared more and more frequently in newspapers, saying that it was time for the country to stop being Washington's echo.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
But behind the discussion of geopolitical intrigues lay a very pragmatic calculation. The elimination of tariffs on Chinese electric cars could be a catalyst for the development of domestic production. Chinese companies were ready to invest in the assembly of cars in Canada, using local materials and labor. The government considered a scenario in which Chinese companies would open factories in Ontario and Quebec, which would provide the country with thousands of jobs and access to battery technologies that Canada does not have. It would be a step away from blindly protecting the market toward modernizing it.